This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where's the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason. So if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome. This is episode 90 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the Serial Mormon History Podcast. Today is Thursday, February 15th, 2018. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. On this episode, we begin with an interview discussing 19th century American politics. Our guest walks us through the rise of the Jacksonian Democratic Party in the wake of the War of 1812, and walks us through how popular opinion and the anti-Jackson sentiments led to the rise and fall of the Whig political party. Dovetailing off the discussion with Chris, we jump into Illinois politics and the formation of the Anti-Mormon political party to combat the growing power of the Saints in Nauvoo and Handcock County politics. The Mormons organized the Nauvoo Legion into a military parade for the 1841 4th of July celebration, which a number of politicians and dignitaries attended to show their support for the Mormons. Joe's truly living the American dream. We're going with a slightly unorthodox approach for today's show. We usually start with the historical timeline segment of the episode and then move on to an interview or something different after that. But for this episode, the interview was simply too relevant, and it sets the scene and provides context for the historical monologue today. So stick around after the interview to see how everything discussed in the interview plays into Nauvoo politics in 1841. Without further ado, here we go with Chris Caldwell. In providing this Serial Mormon History podcast, I hope that one of the major takeaways for the listeners is the fact that history is so much more than names and dates. History is the story of us, and each individual person throughout history has a story to tell. Mormon history isn't Joseph Smith publishing the Book of Mormon in 1830 and then starting a religion only to become a martyr 14 years later. It's not so smarty Marty fighting with his wife who thought the Book of Mormon was a waste of time. It's henchman Sidney Rigdon converting hundreds of his followers to Mormonism, providing a much-needed adrenaline shot to the arm of a dying religion. It's Joe and friends telling the Danites to get the property of the Missouri Gentiles at all costs, lest the Mormons starve for the winter of 1838 to 39. My next guest was a history teacher for 10 years, and now he's the primary host and producer of A Teacher's History of the United States, the Serial American History Podcast. And he's joining us to talk American history and politics, a subject which he tackles every week on his podcast, which has sincerely become my new favorite history podcast. Chris, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Bryce. It's good to be on. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. And you and I have exchanged notes back and forth a little bit in preparation for this interview, and we have a couple of topics that I'd like to hit on. And it sounds like we're kind of on the same page when it comes to American history. You need to understand politics, economics, religion, and so many other factors that all kind of compile together to create this composite theory of American history, which is what you're doing on your podcast, and I think it's absolutely amazing. But before we kind of dive into the points that we're looking to discuss today, I'd like to get a little bit of a history and background on you. How did you come to do the Serial American History podcast?
Well, first off, thanks for the kind words. I appreciate the fact that you listen and you enjoy it, and hopefully you're learning something. To be totally honest with you, in my time teaching U.S. history, and I primarily taught AP U.S. history to high schoolers, I found so often that the complexities of history and the fascinating stories of people, places, events were glossed over too much or were not properly understood. And I always wanted to dive down those rabbit holes in the classroom. but because of, advanced placement curriculum and expectations from the students and their parents, I was unable to do that as often as I would like. And as I continued throughout my teaching career, I ran into more and more people who had been out of school for 10, 20, 30 years. And it wasn't until later that they often confessed to me that they became passionate about history, that they became incredibly interested in history, and that oftentimes they felt almost self-conscious about the fact that they did not know as much about United States history or politics as they would like. And usually it would follow with some type of compliment to make me feel good, saying, oh, well, if only I had you teaching me U.S. history, I would have paid more attention, or I would have gotten straight A's, or some, right. some ridiculous stroke like that. But they they did work to a certain extent when they weren't transparently disingenuous. And so over time, I decided that, there is no podcast out there that told the serial history of the United States from beginning to end. Like, if I were to have my ideal history class all the way from the Age of Exploration to whichever president is the current sitting president when I finish, what are all the things I would cover? How would I tell the story? And what rabbit holes would I dive down into? And so I decided that a podcast is the perfect way to do that. And I've been having a lot of fun with it, and, it's catching on more than I expected it to. And it's been great. It's really been great.
And I have to commend you on how you've kind of structured the podcast, because you are doing this serialized take, which, for the way that I like to learn things, a chronological format is just simply the best way for me to learn something. It's the way that I'm capable of understanding the progression of events and how we came to be where we are. But you also have these extra credit episodes where you will take a break from the chronological progression to dive way down one of these rabbit holes. And I find those to be some of the most fascinating episodes, to be completely honest. And I think that having those tangents available contributes to painting a more holistic picture of American history, because I think that you'll agree with this sentiment that the wide populace of the American population is woefully lacking when it comes to knowledge of their own country's history. And that is truly a shame, because American history may be just, what has been written since the European settlement, but it's a very rich and interesting and fascinating history. And we can tease out so much about the human condition when we examine the history from a, more holistic perspective this way. So I want to kind of also get your take on the proper methods for educating people in history, because history was my least favorite class in high school. I didn't like it because I saw it as nothing more than memorizing names and dates. But obviously there are ways to tell history in a compelling way. Do you want to kind of throw your hat in on how you think is the best way to try and educate people on history, and, maybe the most effective ways that you found in your education career?
Sure. I had a moderate amount of success in my AP US history classes, and I found it pretty quickly. And I think that was because I thought about how I like to learn. Believe it or not, when I was younger, depending on who the history teacher was, I was sometimes disinterested and bored with history class. Oh, yeah. But I still loved history. I grew up loving history, but I cherry picked it big time. And I cherry picked it based on the stories that I could understand. And when the people, places, and events were put into proper context for me, man, the history really took off. So, you can think about the difference between if you visit a historical site and you have the tour guide who's super into it and tells all of these stories about the politics and the relationships and explains all of these things and ties all these threads together for you. And then you go visit a historical site who has the person who looks like they're getting paid minimum wage and hate their life and just walk around just telling you oh, and this tree, this happened, and over here in this plane, this battle happened. And, who wouldn't be bored by that? So, when I decided I was going to go all in and teach history and teach it to the best of my abilities, I wanted to provide context around everything I taught. So whenever we would tackle a topic, we would always talk about what in the past has led to this happening. Now that this has happened, why is it going to be important moving forward? Who is it going to impact? How long is it going to leave an impact? And just continuing to tie those threads together throughout American history. And that's why I decided to make my podcast a serial podcast, because so many of these history podcasts out there are fantastic. I mean, hosts who know a ton, guests who know they've forgotten more about history than I'll probably ever know, which I very much appreciate. But I appreciate it because I know the context. So if I sit and listen to a history podcast on Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, I will get it, because I know the context of the Spanish-American War and the politics and the relationships of the late 19th and early 20th century, and I'll be really into it. But it just kept nagging at me, think about the millions of people out there who would love to hear the story of Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. But even if they listened to this podcast episode, they wouldn't actually be able to truly understand it, because they don't know the context around it, and they don't understand why it's important. And so I think that more than anything else is so important. Whenever you're teaching anything, to tie those threads together and to focus on why. Why is this important? Why are we talking about this? And I would often throw that question out to my class. Hey guys, it was an all boys school, so I'd always say, boys or guys, why did I just teach you this? And I would have them tell me why we just spent 20 minutes on, whatever it is, the Adams-O'Neill Treaty, or Black Hawk's War. And they would have to decide why it's important and sort of put it into context themselves, which I felt like that was an effective way to get it to stick in their heads. That's fantastic. And it obviously the expertise that you've garnered over your teaching career definitely comes through in the podcast. And, kind of speaking on this thread of providing context, I'd like to kind of take that as a jump off point to jump into American history, specifically talking in the very early 19th century. This is a time that was obviously heavy with turmoil and uncertainty of whether or not the British Empire was going to come back and reclaim the colonies, and if they were going to reinstate the king's rule over the people of the American continent. And obviously territories and large countries fighting about what territory will be U.S. territory versus what will be owned by the French or by the United Kingdom or so on and so forth. And I find the War of 1812 as quite a fascinating aspect that plays into all of this. And in order to tie this to Mormonism specifically, back in, I believe it was 2014, there was a study that was done that looked at, it basically used college-level plagiarism software in order to find authorship attributions for the Book of Mormon, which is, the seminal text for the Mormon religion. And this study teased out a book called The Late War of 1812 Between Great Britain and the United States. And this book was written in 1816, and it was a textbook that was written in the basically the King James English in order to instill a love of the Bible and a love of history in the readers of it. And it was a textbook that was used in Joseph Smith's time when he would have been, occasionally attending school for, a season or two at a time. And then we find a number of phrases that are included in this War of 1812 book that are extremely similar to phrases that are in the Book of Mormon. So it scores very high on this plagiarism scale. And obviously the War of 1812, that was at a time that Joseph Smith was 7-8 years old. Mm-hmm. This was obviously had a dramatic impact on his young mind. The British coming into town and burning the Capitol, obviously that's going to have a significant impact on anybody who was an American citizen at the time. So let's go ahead and dive into the War of 1812 a little bit and kind of the post-war nationalism and how that kind of bled into the 1820s, possibly fueling a bit of the religious fervor and burned over that contributed to the burned over district. Yeah, and I think that if, without diving deep into the War of 1812, it was a war fought between the United States of America and Britain. If the war, I always love to teach. I live in Baltimore, Maryland, and that's where Fort McHenry is, and that's where the Star-Spangled Banner was written. And during Orioles games, we yell "Oh" really loud during the national anthem because of that, and they're perfectly obnoxious about it. The War of 1812 is pretty much a draw the United States of America saw it as a victory, and they had the right to see it as a victory because the British invaded the United States of America. They burned down the White House. They eventually were held back at the Battle of Baltimore, and they gave up. They signed the Treaty of Ghent in December 24th, 1815, and then there was actually the Battle of New Orleans was fought after the treaty was signed in early 1816 because word had not gotten back across the Atlantic that the war was over and the British had given up.
And the rise of General Jackson's career is realized.
Absolutely, yes. That's what I was just about to say. And General Andrew Jackson became obviously incredibly famous for it in general and will then become President Andrew Jackson. But I think the most important part of it is the nationalism and the national unity that comes out of the War of 1812. And we see significant progress in the United States of America socially, politically, and economically during the era of good feelings, 1816 to 1824 under James Monroe. And then we see more progress under John Quincy Adams after the election of 1824. And then you get Andrew Jackson in 1828 and 1832. And then things begin to fracture a bit. But throughout that time period, as you and your listeners know, you have Joseph Smith growing of age. You have the birth of the Mormon faith and the traveling of the Mormon people across the West. And, of course, their persecution at various times, right? Obviously, you can you know better than anyone, and a lot of that comes from, and we can dive deeper into this later. But I think the context around all of this is that during this rise of nationalism and a single political and social identity following the War of 1812 comes groups like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the Mormons who were different. And we're talking about different ideas and different beliefs, and that was a challenge to the national psyche of the United States of America, and that was one of the big reasons for the pushback.
So I want to hit a little bit more on the Jacksonian Democrat, because this was a mentality. It wasn't a party affiliation. This was something where in our previous conversation, you kind of enlightened me to some of the details of Jackson's reign, essentially, King Jackson, Old Hickory, right? Prior to him taking the, creating this grassroots democratic movement, the office of president didn't have quite as much power. Jackson comes into office and he gets elected by, a what can I say, a very ideological populace. And then he comes in and signs the Indian Removal Act, against the majority of politicians and the better counsel of, his cabinet. He comes in and does these various decrees that are seen as dictatorial almost to a certain extent. Can we talk a little bit about his influence on kind of the collective psyche of the office of president and how it kind of shifted during that, little 8-year span?
Sure. And I think that's a really good topic to jump off from with regards to Andrew Jackson. There are a few different presidents in our history that redefine the role of the presidency. Of course, George Washington's one, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, etc. And any big history lover will argue that you're wrong, and the president that they think is most defining is really the one most defining.
Of course,
I'm not going to give my opinion on which is most influential, but those are usually that's really the short list there. But so let me take one step back. The election of 1824 sees Andrew Jackson run against John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams. Up to this point, the presidency is seen as, yes, he's the executive, but he does not really wield his executive authority unless he absolutely had to, and that didn't really happen often, and sometimes it backfired. Jefferson tried it a couple times, it sort of backfired. Adams tried it a couple times, and it backfired. So what we see a country that is dominated by local politics, is dominated by the House of Representatives and the Senate, and it's dominated by the land-holding white male demographic. And in 1824, no candidate receives a majority of the electoral votes. And when that happens, the vote goes to the House of Representatives. And I'll try and be pithy with the description of this election, but it is important. What ends up happening is the House votes for John Quincy Adams. And one of the reasons they do that is because Henry Clay dropped out of the running and threw his support behind Adams. Well, when Clay does that, Jackson is furious. Jackson had the most votes by far, electoral votes, popular votes. He believed he should be president and that he got screwed. And he had a right to believe that, especially after John Quincy Adams made Henry Clay the Secretary of State.
It was seen as a political favor, basically. It was, a little bit of trading office for trading support. Absolutely.
100%. And not only that, Bryce, but, as you know, moving up to this point, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, and John Quincy Adams, four presidents in a row, had moved from Secretary of State to the presidency. So Jackson basically saw this as John Quincy Adams setting up Clay to be the next president.
For the 1828 election.
Yes, for the 1828 election or 1832, depending on how long JQA wanted to stay in office. So Jackson's furious, right? And he actually, the one thing you'll find out about Jackson is that when he determines that you are his enemy, he is of a very fixed mindset of almost everything in life, which is interesting because usually those people aren't quite as successful, but he definitely was. And Adams and Clay became his enemy, and they will forever be his enemies. And he actually travels throughout many of the southern states in between 1824 and 1828, convincing their local legislatures and state legislatures to expand the voting rights to more white males in their state. So basically lower the property requirements in those states, knowing that when he does this, all of these people whom he is lobbying to give voting rights to are going to be people that will support him in the 1828 election. And that's exactly what happens. And he just runs roughshod over Adams in the 1828 election and, goes into the White House being truly, in his mind, a man of the people.
And it's worth taking a quick side note to point out here. The Democratic Party was founded by Andrew Jackson, and the party moniker of the jackass, the stubborn jackass, that was a description of Andrew Jackson's own personality, because he was just that. He was a tough old hickory, War of 1812 veteran. He had been in these various military positions, but he wasn't seen as a politician by any stretch of imagination. And he did kind of pander to those, the less educated, the more populist kind of vote. And that's where he kind of got this moniker of being the stubborn jackass that created the Democratic Party, because he didn't seem to like to move when he was opposed by somebody. It's kind of interesting to see the genesis of all of these things that have lasted, over 200 years in our politics today.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. And I think when, a couple things to note about Jackson, he grew up a poor young man. He had a run-in with the British, actually, when he was younger, a British soldier. So he hated the British, of course, because, once an enemy, always an enemy. And he was a war hero who studied for the bar and basically was a self-made man. And then when he became married to Rachel, he then became tied into local politics and wealth. And so that's what helped him ascend to the presidency. But he was one that very much identified himself as a common man. And this idea of white man's democracy was extremely important to him. And so you mentioned earlier that Andrew Jackson is a man of the people, but then, he gets into the presidency and does things that are almost seemingly dictatorial. And wouldn't those two things not coincide with each other, right? They're for sure hypocritical. But when you but when you think about it and you dive deeper into the history and understand the context and the story around it, they're really not hypocritical at all. And this was always something that my students challenged me with and had a hard time understanding. But Bryce, if you were if you felt like there was a segment of the population, a majority of the population that was genuinely being screwed over by the landed elite and they vote to elect you president, then you are going to do everything you can to make sure that you're constantly looking out for their best interest as best you know how, especially if the landed elite are the ones in Congress who are trying to tell you what to do. And
something else to kind of throw into the mix as well is something that's not necessarily quantifiable, and that is how the Jackson being elected as this new populist president who had, been screwed over in the 1824 election by the popular vote. He now has the support of the majority of these Southern Democrats to whom he had pandered for, years in his campaign trail in politics. And he kind of galvanized this idea of majority rule, right? Never again will the president be decided by a non-popular vote. We are going to get the majority to rule this. And that's an idea that definitely contributed to Missouri being able to successfully chase the Mormons out of the state in 1838 and 39 because they were a persecuted minority. The Missourians didn't like them, but this is Jackson's democracy. And Missouri was, a democratic state, and they didn't want all of these Yankees coming in and trying to teach their slaves how to read and whatnot. So, finally the majority is galvanized against the Mormons, and the majority rules in that sense. And, I don't think there's a way that we can properly describe how Jackson's campaign kind of had an impact on the general perception of majority rule in the United States.
Well, I think that during this time in the 1830s, what you have is you have a very clear delineation between those that are interested in local politics. They're interested in their own well-being. They're interested in holding on to their right to own slaves. As I mentioned in one of my podcast episodes, I can't remember which one now, I think the Fourth Amendment, the right to property, is probably the most underrated amendment in the Constitution because basically that's what the revolutionary protest began with, and that's what the war was fought over. And everyone seems to forget that. But what
so,
you
Chris, do you have on the mud flaps of your truck a little rattlesnake that says "Don't tread on me"? As well?
I do not. I did have someone on Twitter call me a neoliberal the other day.
Oh, wow.
And
all right then.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of those things where depending on what event or what topic I'm talking about, you probably think I go from one end of the spectrum to the other. I'm not particularly consistent with overall ideologies because, as I found, when you look at events individually, the more you know about them, it becomes very clear what side you should fall on, depending on the circumstances and the context around them. It becomes very clear what side I should fall on. But
fair enough. Just a little diversion. That's
exactly. But what you have is you have a clear cut in the American populace, and you have the wealthy elites who want to stabilize the money supply. They want to reinvigorate the transportation system with canals and railroads, the rechartering of the Second Bank of the United States. They want to extend America's power abroad, like with the Monroe Doctrine, telling Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. So you have men like that, like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and John Quincy Adams, who are on one side of this political equation, and they are representing everything that is seemingly corrupt and wrong with the United States of America from the eyes of those Missourians in the 1830s and those in Tennessee and Georgia in the 1820s and 30s, because they believe that these landed elites were born with a silver spoon in their mouth, and they would like to use the tax dollars and the revenue off of the tariffs to continue to further their own agenda, to continue to bring wealth to the North, et cetera. And that's just not something that most Americans in those areas, the South and the Midwest, were even remotely interested in doing.
I mean, the labels may change, but the algorithm seems to remain true, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah, yes, it does. There's a clear consistency throughout the United States history for sure, just with different circumstances.
So let's talk about then, in response to Jackson's democracy, we have him right as he's leaving office signing the Specie Circular, which basically said that the United States government is no longer going to take proprietary banknotes in the form of taxes. They require actual American specie in order to do so. And that obviously kind of popped the bubble of the 1830s and essentially incited the Panic of 1837. Let's talk a little bit on that. What happened there?
So I know I keep going back to this, but once you are an enemy of Andrew Jackson, you are always an enemy of Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson, I mean,
he is the jackass.
Seriously, it's true. It's unbelievable the grudges that this man held. But that passion is also what made him successful. That's what made him able to live most of his life with a bullet buried in his chest right by his heart from a duel that he won, and actually live and become president. So what happens is Andrew Jackson has a bad experience when he's younger with the bank. And, he basically, if I recall correctly, he vouched for a friend over a debt. He was then stuck with the debt. He almost got sent to debtor's prison. It could have ended terribly. Ever since then, I kid you not, he hated banks. And so because of course he did. The Second Bank of the United States, which was chartered in 1816, rechartered, and was given a 20-year term, this, in Jackson's mind, was totally corrupt. He believed, he's a small government Southern Democrat for the most part, except for when he's part of the government and he calls the shots. Then it's okay to be big government. But
small government, big president.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Very good. I like that. And so he believed that, number one, the government didn't have the right to create this bank. It was unconstitutional for them to do it. And number two, this bank was holding the public deposits from the federal government, but also private funds too. And it was run by directors and stockholders. So it wasn't answerable to the people. So here you have a bank that is taking in tax dollars and being held, but the dollars, the people whom these tax dollars are coming from can't do anything about it. They have no power over the bank. And so Andrew Jackson thought that was extremely flawed and way too much power for the federal government with no real check. He also was told that the bank tried to help John Quincy Adams defeat Jackson in his re-election campaign in 1828. Who knows how true that is, but truth doesn't matter, right? In politics, feelings are just as important as the truth.
Truth is much better when it's just called fake news, right?
Yeah, absolutely, right? Absolutely. It's all fake news. And so what we have found, especially recently, is that genuinely, and I mean this, I'm not trying to be sarcastic here. The truth doesn't really matter. It just doesn't.
That is the takeaway of all of 2017 right there. The truth can be quickly disposed of because it doesn't matter.
Yes, anymore. because people make decisions emotionally and then they justify them intellectually. So when they go to the polling booth, they will make their decision based on their emotions, and then they will seek out information to justify that action intellectually. So if you can get people feeling a certain way, that's all that matters. So Jackson hated the bank. It didn't matter what it was doing for the United States of America, its infrastructure, its wealth, its international dominance. He hated the bank. He distrusted the bank, and that was never going to change. So he was looking out for ways to justify his feelings, and he found that in men like Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and Nicholas Biddle, who ran the bank. So what happens is the bank is rechartered in 1816. It's given a 20-year lease, right? Or 20-year term lease, goodness. It had a 20-year term. And so it was going to be up in 1836 for recharter. And when Jackson's coming up with his reelection in 1832, his reelection's on the horizon, Henry Clay, his arch enemy in Congress, said, you know what, screw Andrew Jackson. Let's put the bank up for recharter 4 years early. That will show him. because when it passes overwhelmingly in Congress, there's no way he will do anything about it because he will lose significant votes in states like Pennsylvania. Well, Andy Veto, which Andrew Jackson became aptly nicknamed, he vetoed more pieces of legislation in his presidency than the 6 presidents before him combined. Vetoed it. Yeah, I know, right?
That's a crazy stat. I didn't know that.
He actually used the veto. Whereas, and we talked about earlier how most presidents really just did whatever Congress told them to. Andrew Jackson did not. And so he genuinely felt like he was there to represent the people. The people elected him to veto things exactly like this. And so that's what he did. And he did it, and he was very proud to do it. He said to Van Buren, like, the bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it. His vice president, Martin Van Buren. Yeah, I know, right? Yeah. And so he liked to win. He liked to win. And so Nicholas Biddle, who was running the bank, almost to get back to retaliate against Jackson, made it harder for businesses to take out loans. And then Jackson, after he vetoed the recharter of the bank, well, now it's like a dead man walking. It has 4 years left, but the president has basically just torpedoed its future. So Jackson then took it one step further and started pulling funds out of the bank and putting them in state and local banks called like his pet banks.
Right.
And at the end of his presidency, so this is causing an economic contraction already. In 1833, 1834. And then at the end of his presidency, he took it one step further and said that this paper money can't be trusted, and that this paper money was being used to take advantage of the people within the United States, the Democratic electorate within the United States that basically, let me start over. Basically, what Andrew Jackson was saying, I had a coughing fit there, is that he felt like the bank was, and the issuing of paper money by all of these banks was allowing things to get out of control. And he realized that it was a bit too hard to maintain order over all of these state and local banks. So he issued the specie circular, and it said, well, now you can only pay for things in hard coin. And that, of course, created a horrible economic disaster in the Panic of 1837. He, in retrospect, should he have seen it coming? Probably should have seen it coming. But Martin Van Buren was the one that really took the brunt of all the blame. And that's why Martin Van Buren only had one term, even though he was the puppet master behind the entire thing. And I just want to point that out before we move on from Andrew Jackson. Martin Van Buren, he was the man behind the curtain throughout this entire presidency and the creation of the Jacksonian Democrats. It was all Van Buren, and of course he was left to clean up Jackson's mess, and he and Jackson actually ended up with not so great a relationship in the end. So a bit of a sad story, but
but not terribly surprising, because it was quite a mess, and it had repercussions throughout the entire industrialized world. I mean, Britain was obviously making a lot of money buying and trading with America. France was rebuilding after the Napoleonic era and, trading a lot with America as well. And suddenly you have the economy in America collapses, and suddenly exports, drop significant portions. You have the countries who are the primary trading partners with America are suddenly feeling the pinch of America's own manufactured panic, basically. And this may be, kind of crazy to try and claim or trying to throw out there, but would you say that the Panic of 1837 might be one of the first times where we actually had like a globally felt type of panic, or an economic bubble pop like this in much way that had never really before been seen?
In United States history, yes. I think that, I don't think that's an outlandish statement. Obviously, with everything, as you know, in history and politics, it can be picked apart, 10 ways to Sunday. But
of course,
yes, I think that's a fair statement. This is really the first time there's a major economic crisis in the United States of America. Of course, there have been issues here and there, but nothing to this magnitude. And the crazy thing is this comes after Andrew Jackson balanced the budget. He got the United States of America out of debt. And he was the last president to do it. So
I was going to say, well,
we haven't had the, Jefferson tried and failed because his approach was flawed. Jackson's approach was clearly in the end pretty flawed too, but he did it. So there was for a long time financial security and things were going great. But as you mentioned, that common phrase, that bubble burst. And so the post-War of 1812 bubble had been building and building and building for 20 years. And Andrew Jackson basically just put the pin right to it and had it burst all at once as opposed to slowly, recessing down. And, the United States of America, and as you mentioned, the rest of the world paid the price for it.
So obviously Martin Van Buren spends the next term in office, and he is trying to clean up the mess that's left behind by Jackson. But also at the same time, this is kind of where our timeline fits into, Mormon history of our timeline fits into the broader sense of American history here, because right now our timeline is sitting in the spring to summer of 1841. And this is kind of during the uprising of the Whig Party, which was kind of in direct response to what Jackson had done. So can we kind of, jump off of this topic and wrap this discussion up into how the Whig Party was created and the reasons behind why it was created and why it fizzled out so quickly after creation?
Sure. So Post-War of 1812, you have the era of good feelings in which you basically just have one dominant political party in the National Republicans. The Federalists pretty much died out because they were seen as unpatriotic following the war, because anyone who's against the war, obviously hates America. So Federalists had died out. The National Republicans dominated. And what ends up happening, the Democratic Republicans dominate. And what ends up happening is Andrew Jackson runs as a Democrat, and then John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay will run as National Republicans. And that was clearly a failure because Jackson won twice and then Van Buren won. So then that fizzled out. Well, following Jackson's second election, the frustration with him was at an all-time high. So former Federalists, former National Republicans, anti-Masons, which were basically like anti-elites who really hated the Freemasons, and the disaffected Jacksonians, because remember, Jackson also picked a fight with his former Vice President John C. Calhoun, who was also a Southerner, and he was very states' rights. So there were some states' rights Southerners who didn't like Jackson either, in the mold of John C. Calhoun, and they created basically an anti-Andrew Jackson party. And that's pretty much what it was. It was it derived itself from its name from the British Whig Party, but it didn't have any real political affiliation to the British Whig Party.
Okay.
Yeah. And so many of the patriots who were really pissed at King George and spoke out publicly against King George considered themselves Whigs. And so that's where the American political term came from.
Good to know.
And as you can imagine, anytime you have a political party that is pretty much galvanized by their hatred for one man, that is a very tenuous situation because that guy is going to be gone soon enough. And that,
certainly.
And that's what happened. So the Whig Party, nicknames Andrew Jackson King Andrew and Andy Veto, and they support Henry Clay's idea of the American system, like protective tariffs, international improvements, strong national bank. They lose in 1836 against Van Buren because they ran a few different candidates and they weren't really galvanized enough. In 1840, they made progress and they ran William Henry Harrison, who was a war hero. John Tyler ran as his vice president. His catchphrase was Tippecanoe and Tyler too, because he was
of course,
he was the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe.
Yeah,
and the
killed
Whigs,
Tecumseh, apparently. But
Yes.
as I understand it, like 14 different people claim that they killed Tecumseh. So yeah, whatever.
Yes. But as you know, Bryce, as we have established, the facts do
doesn't
not matter when it comes to politics. I mean this very sincerely. The facts don't matter. It's the story that you can tell. And William Henry Harrison, speaking of facts not mattering, he grew up wealthy. I mean, this dude is really wealthy. He comes from a wealthy family, never really had many struggles in his life, and he runs on the log cabin and cider campaign. And the Whigs actually paint him like a backcountry guy who rose to fame to have military glory, which sounds pretty familiar. And it worked. It worked. So he won in 1840. And then
it worked for 3 months, right?
Yeah, yes, very good. It worked for 3 months. He gave a very long speech when at his inauguration. Some people claim he got sick. Other historians will go to their grave saying that had nothing to do with his illness 3 months later. Who am I to say? I don't think it did, but whatever. So John Tyler took over. John Tyler wasn't Whig enough. And so that caused a lot of infighting in the Whig Party. In 1844, they failed to defeat James K. Polk because he had such an appealing message of expansion. He wanted to take Oregon and Texas, and he basically did both of those things. And then so the Whigs went back to the old tried and true formula, and they ran a war hero, Zachary Taylor.
Hang on, can we also talk? This may be my ignorance coming into play here, but could also a contributing factor to the Whigs not being able to pull off a candidate in that election? Might that also be that there was such a new party and it didn't have the cohesive and staying powerness of the other of the previous parties? Or I mean, because that seems like it might have a problem as well. Jackson comes in a flash in the pan, founds a Democratic Party, gets in there, gets reelected. And following the bodies left behind in his warpath, you can understand that there is, a bit of a populist uprising that contributed to the Whig Party, but there may not have been enough cohesiveness within the party in order to get that person elected, and enough third party voters can rip a single party apart, right?
Yeah, and that's a really great point. That had a lot to do with it. And like I mentioned earlier, when you have a party that is created by their hatred for one man, and then that man leaves the political scene, then what are they left with? And that was really the challenge for the Whigs, is because they were able to bring in all these disparate groups because of Andrew Jackson. And once Andrew Jackson left, many of those disaffected anti-Jackson people weren't totally on board with what the Whigs were trying to do. And John Tyler taking over as president after William Henry Harrison died really that made it extremely difficult because he didn't support Whig policies. Mm-hmm. So you have a Whig, technically a quote-unquote Whig president who was only vice president to help William Henry Harrison have a broader appeal. They did not want him to be president at all. They had no desire for him ever to be president. Amazing. And I mean, when you think about it, William Henry Harrison's the first man ever to die in office. So, they didn't really see this coming, of course.
Yeah, fair. That's fair enough.
It didn't help that it happened 3 months in. So it was basically John Tyler was president the whole time. And the Whigs were like, well, hell, we finally got this party galvanized. We finally got it off the ground. And now this guy is basically, he's like a saboteur within our own party that we handpicked. Right? And so the Whigs lose a lot. And James K. Polk was a very appealing candidate. He was all about taking Texas, annexing Texas. He was, all about annexing the Oregon Territory. And Henry Clay ran as the Whig representative, and he was popular within his own circles. Guy ran for president like 4 freaking times and lost every time, but he was viewed almost as an also-ran, right? Oh shit, great. Henry Clay's running for president again. Fantastic.
Yeah, right.
How exciting. And so
Henry Clay Clinton.
Yeah, exactly. Well, seriously, right? I mean, you have people who totally agree with her policies, and we're like, Jesus, seriously? Again?
This is what we're working with.
Yeah. And so that predetermined candidate is never one that's going to get people emotionally involved. But I digress. But when Polk ran, he said, like, hey, if you elect me, I'll only serve for one term. And to his credit, he did. And so he stepped down. And the Whigs were able to get it together enough to run a popular candidate, a war hero in 1848 with Zachary Taylor. But what ends up happening, and I'll get to the point here with the devolution of the Whig Party, what ends up happening is during Zachary Taylor's presidency, you have the Compromise of 1850. And the Compromise of 1850 allowed California to join the Union as a free state. It then enacted a stricter Fugitive Slave Act. It ended the slave trade in Washington, D.C., a very controversial bill that tried to compromise between the North and the South.
And it also, if I'm not mistaken, it also included like new territories that would be annexed at later times to be slave territories as well, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
Yeah. So, what happened is that was the Missouri Compromise of 1820.
Oh,
and the
My
Missouri,
mistake.
But I'm really glad you brought that up, because this is what made the Compromise of 1850 so frustrating. Is the Missouri Compromise of 1820 said that Missouri would be free, but all the states Missouri would be a slave state, but all the states below that 3630 line would be slave, and all the ones above it, like Missouri, actually, would be free.
Yes.
And they drew that like imaginary line, right, all the way out to the Pacific. Well, when they allowed California to join as a free state, a lot of Southern Democrats were like, what the hell? What was the whole point of that 3630 line if you're just going to totally ignore it and add California as a free state? And so a lot of Southerners felt like they weren't getting a great deal out of this. What happens is the Whig Party had support throughout the North and the South, and they basically split over the Compromise of 1850. More or less.
Context, right?
Yep,
that's the whole point of that.
That's what it's all about, man. That's what, history is a story. And I would always tell my students, you can't read chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 and then skip to chapter 8 and think you know what the hell's going on. Because you don't.
Exactly. Yep.
And so they basically split after the Compromise of 1850 into Northern and Southern, and then you have Stephen Douglas and the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, and he tries to manipulate adding those as democratically chosen territories. Like he basically says, oh, well, they can vote on whether or not they want to be free or slave. And then all the Northerners are like, what the heck?
Right. Why can states' rights?
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Why can they vote? The whole point of the Missouri Compromise was so we could already predetermine what they would be. These are supposed to be free states. Why are you allowing them to vote? And so you have a lot going on. And then you have the Know Nothing Party, which was rising up during this time, which was a very nativist, anti-immigrant party. And this actually drew a lot of the Whigs, especially Whigs in port cities and more closer to the East Coast, who had to deal with immigration. They were very anti-Catholic, very anti-Irish, anti-German. It was basically like a WASP party. And so they were able to take a lot of former Whig supporters. And then in the North, things are becoming very clearly divided over slavery. Year after year, it's becoming more and more clear. And in the North, you have the next modern political party, the Republican Party, which is rising in the North, and that becomes solidified in 1854. And of course, Abraham Lincoln, 1860, being the first Republican president ever. With Andrew Fremont running as the first Republican candidate in 1856, and having he had a valiant effort at the presidency that he should be very proud of, but didn't really come close to winning. And then Lincoln was able to get over the hump in 1860. And so that is the very circuitous story around the Whig Party and its rise and fall. And I think you're learning through this episode that once you ask me open-ended questions, the rules are off, unfortunately, and I apologize.
No. I'm going to cut you off there. It's not unfortunate for anyone. I have been wonderfully enlightened by this whole conversation, and I think it adds some much needed context to the politics and the political movements that were going on in the church as they were, getting out of Missouri and beginning to settle in Illinois, because you had the Mormons who were voting as a bloc and the politicians in Illinois who were deciding, they were posed with this question of whether or not the Mormons are here to stay, because the Mormons had spent, a whole 6-7 years in Ohio. Then they were chased out. They had spent only a year in Missouri, and the Democrats there, the mob rule, kicked them out of that state. So they weren't there for long. But if they minded their P's and Q's, to use old typesetter speak, while they were in Illinois, then that means that they're a massive voting bloc that's going to be around for decades, and any politician that panders to the Mormons is going to get elected for many, many election cycles, moving forward. Because, you have Chicago at this time in the 1840s with a population of, 2,500, 3,500 people maybe, and Nauvoo at this time had upwards of 15,000 people in 1844. That is a massive voting bloc. The number of delegates that they're pulling in, the number of politicians and justices that Mormons are getting appointed because they get a Mormon in, a higher office because they're such a massive bloc. It just goes to show that, at this state, politics are incredibly important, and the Mormons would vote with whomever Joseph Smith and his council decided. And they decided based on who would do them the most favors, the old back scratching game. And I love to see how this kind of played out, and seeing the different political movements as they're teased around between Whig candidates and Democrat candidates, and trying to decide what's best for the Mormons. And then if one politician completely screws them over, they just throw the entire Mormon voting bloc over to the Democrat side instead, while still promising this Whig over here their votes. And it's just chaos and pandemonium. And it just shows that the point that I was making earlier, the variables and the labels may change, but the algorithms still hold true, and we can still see this same political maneuvering happening in so many instances. And I love history for that reason, because we can tease out these very human things that happen to us on a day-to-day basis, and we can see examples of these human things replete throughout history. And I feel like once we understand those things, we can come to a better reconciliation of why we choose to do things the way we do. And I think, seeing history in proper context is a great way to understand why the world is the way it is right now, because you have to understand where we came from. So all of that said, Chris, I want to thank you so much for coming on. This has really been a pleasure. I'm going to once again recommend to everybody A Teacher's History of the United States. It is such a fantastic podcast. He's cracking episode 40, I believe you just put out this week.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Episode 40. I sort of lose track because I have a few more recorded, and yeah, episode 40. Basically, we're starting up, we just finished the Stamp Act and the Declaratory Act. Now we're on to the Townshend Acts, and the Revolutionary War is just, or the Revolutionary period is just ramping up.
Fantastic. So everybody, you're at the ground level on this podcast. There's not a massive backlog to chug through. There's not, 190,000 episodes that you have to try and grind through. No, this is early on. This is very important foundational information to understand a serial history of America. Listeners, please go check it out. Check the show notes to get to it. Chris, is there anywhere you want to send people, or anything you want to plug, a social media or anything like that?
I mean, not really. I'm not. If you listen to the podcast, I'm not a huge plugger, so to speak. I'm on Twitter at at A Teacher's Hist, and the website is ateachershistory.com. I have a Facebook page too. But more than anything else, the purpose of the podcast is just to do what we've done today, and that's talk about history and try to provide context for what happens in throughout history and what happens now. And I think more than anything, it's all about self-preservation. And as depressing as that sounds, that's the truth to it. And I thank you very much for having me on this podcast. and I hope I was able to contribute something and maybe enlighten your listeners to, like you said, some of the context around what you're describing now. And I'm looking forward to having you on mine when we get a bit closer to Mormon history, and you can drop some knowledge on me. And I'm really looking forward to that.
Absolutely. I really hope we get to 1838 at some point, and you'll have me on to talk about the Missouri Mormon War. That's good fun right there.
Yeah, 100%. Yes.
Yep. Absolutely. So yeah, once again, Chris, you have been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for teaching us so much, and I hope to have you on in the future.
Sounds good to me. I would look forward to it.
Once again, huge thanks to Chris for coming on and telling us about 19th century American politics and kind of putting everything into context. And context, obviously, as he drove home multiple times, is the most important part to take away when it comes to learning history. So what can we derive from that conversation? Well, politics is the mechanism by which so much is accomplished in America and really everywhere else. And the truth of the matter is, when you're somebody like Joseph Smith, and you're a person trying to organize thousands of people into a cohesive body, or you're trying to build a city, or anything that Joseph was doing at this time, politics is going to claim a significant portion of your time. The Mormons in Nauvoo were a massive population with varying needs and desires. There was always the underlying need to follow the prophet, and the prophet's need to provide direction and a safe place for his people to live. And there's a lot wrapped up into those just two seemingly simple concepts. Today, we take issue with any religious leader who oversteps their boundaries when it comes to politics, right? A religious leader shouldn't be free from political opinion, but when they preach political action from the pulpit, that's where it's actionable, legally speaking. As Jefferson said in his 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, quote, "I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should, quote, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the exercise thereof." Back to Jefferson, "thus building a wall of separation between church and state," end quote. The way churches are policed in actions violative of church and state separation is through taxing. If a church acts in politics, they lose their tax-exempt status. Well, that's how it should be. This is completely unenforced today, and it's an issue which has only come up a small handful of times in the court system in the last 150 years. Many churches today participate in what's known as the Pulpit Freedom Sunday, where they literally videotape themselves making political speeches from the pulpit and send those videos to the IRS, daring the IRS to prosecute these egregious violations of church and state separation. These ideas we have of needing to maintain a wall between church and state weighed heavily on the minds of the Founding Fathers when writing the Bill of Rights. America was founded as a secular nation, and when churches have infringed upon the political process, it's bothered people throughout American history, and it should bother everybody today while it continues to happen every single day. Joseph Smith couldn't create Nauvoo and organize the Mormons without dabbling in politics. A person can be a politician and a preacher, but when they wear both those hats at the same time, that's when they're in violation of church and state separation. Joe happened to wear all of his hats all of the time. He was a prophet, preacher, prosecutor, militia general, politician, and everything in between all hours of all days. And try as I might, I can't conceive of a way that Joe could have done what he did in creating Nauvoo without dipping his toes into so many different pools. Don't get me wrong, I don't think that he should have done any of what he did, but I can scarcely conceive of a reality where Joe didn't need to spend equal amounts of time on politics as he did religion once he was at the Nauvoo stage of his history. People like Thomas Coke Sharp saw the brazen demolition of this wall of separation in Nauvoo and wanted to do what was necessary to curtail the power of the Mormon prophet. Thanks to Jonathan Tyndall of the Secular Stories podcast, Thomas Sharp will be known to us as the Sharp Bastard, paying homage to his role in being the sword of justice against Mormon overreach in the political sphere. So the Sharp Bastard, with his newly endowed name-o nickname, took a full swing at Stephen Douglas for appointing Reckitt Bennett to the office of Master in Chancery and letting Joe off by granting the writ of habeas corpus. The Sharp Bastard had published in the Warsaw Signal the electoral delegate rationing based on population statistics. Nauvoo had twice the political representation of Warsaw, and Sharp wanted to respond. He did so by creating the actual Anti-Mormon political party, founded for the sole purpose of combating the increasing political power of the Mormons in Nauvoo. Sharp published the minutes from the very first anti-Mormon political meeting in the 23rd June 1841 edition of the Warsaw Signal, and I quote, "Headline, Anti-Mormon Meeting. At an anti-Mormon meeting of the citizens of Warsaw Precinct, Handcock County, Illinois, held on the 19th of June, 1841, for the purpose of electing delegates to the Anti-Mormon Convention, to be held at Carthage, Hancock, Illinois, on the 28th instant, for the purpose of nominating suitable candidates to be voted for by the anti-Mormon citizens of Hancock County. At the ensuing election," then it lists a number of names of people and the positions that they were elected to. We're going to skip over those names. Names were appointed to a committee to report to the meeting the names of the suitable delegates to attend the convention to be held at Carthage on the 28th instant. W.H. Roosevelt then stated to the meeting that he would offer the following resolution in order to call out any opposition that might be felt to the proposed anti-Mormon convention. Just a quick pause before reading the rest of that article. When the Mormons became so powerful, it was answered by this anti-Mormon political party. And of course, the anti-Mormon political party was going to be opposed by the Mormons. So this is the resolution that W.H. Roosevelt brought forward in order to combat the anti-Mormon convention politics. It says, quote, "Resolved that it is expedient to hold a county convention for the purpose of nominating candidates for the offices of school and county commissioners in opposition to Mormon influence and dictation." Mr. Roosevelt addressed the meeting in favor of the resolution and was followed by J.C. Davis, Esquire, who replied to him in opposition to the convention. A little bit of infighting going on inside the anti-Mormon party as soon as it's being founded here. It's interesting. Although, as he said, he was as much as any opposed to the Mormons, and he again was answered by Thomas Sharp, that's our Sharp bastard, in favor of the convention and of the objects embraced in the resolution. The question was then put to vote, and the resolution sustained with but one dissenting vote. The nominating committee then reported to the meeting the following gentlemen as delegates to attend the convention at Carthage, which report was accepted and the nomination confirmed by the meeting. And then after that, it lists the names of all of the delegates that they are electing specifically to be anti-Mormon delegates to combat the Mormon influence. And then it finally concludes with, on motion of Mr. Roosevelt, resolved that the delegates to the convention have power to fill such vacancies as they occur from inability to attend or otherwise, end quote. And thus the first actual anti-Mormon political party was organized by Thomas the Sharp as a Bastard Sharp to combat the ever-increasing power of the Mormon religion and Joseph Smith in Illinois. Those like Sharp who wanted to combat Mormon politics were left with a complicated task. They couldn't just elect more Democrats or elect more Whigs because the Mormons weren't loyal to either of these parties. They weren't loyal to anybody for that matter, except for Joseph Smith. The Mormons voted as a bloc for whomever it was that Joe said was the Mormons' guy in any given election. Whig, Democrat, old school Federalist, turned Democrat, it didn't matter. The Mormons voted for whoever would make them the biggest promises. For that reason, it was actually necessary and best for the democratic process to form the so-called anti-Mormon party. That's how politics works. Somebody moves into your state and becomes a new majority. You form a minority to directly oppose them. It may not be the best system or even optimal by any stretch of imagination, but that's how the system is constructed. So Sharp and his fellow anti-Mormons were forced to operate within the constraints of the system. They just weren't all that inventive or creative when it came to naming it. I mean, it's kind of ham-fisted, the anti-Mormon party. Anyway, Sharp was aware of this system and the limitations by which it operated. This is from the July 7th article of the Warsaw Signal. Quote, "You need scarcely be reminded of the cringing sycophancy heretofore manifested by both political parties towards the head of this people, knowing well his vast political importance." This people being the Mormons, of course. As a consequence of this, you have seen your legislature granting them charters containing powers nearly, if not quite, equal to their own without even reading the contents of their enactments. In this enlightened age, so-called men are found willing to frame and bring forward charters affecting the dearest rights of our citizens and for the purpose of concealing their dark designs, Talos, and fulfilling the pledges given by the politicians to this people. Their passage is urged through our legislative halls with racehorse rapidity, under motions to read the bills simply by their titles. In return for the receipt of these high-handed favors, votes of thanks have been bandied out, evincing a species of flattery, fulsome to disgust. Under this state of things, the old party landmarks of Whig and Democrat, so far as it relates to this county, are now laid aside. The insignia under which you have honestly fought so many well-contested battles are now furled together, and a new banner is spread out, upon which you have inscribed the principles of anti-Mormonism." End quote. And really, it's hard to overstate how powerful the Mormons were in Nauvoo, politically speaking. Thomas Gregg in The Prophet of Palmyra does the issue of fair treatment when talking Mormon and Illinois politics of 1840 to 1841. This is beginning on page 166 of his book. Quote, "It will be remembered that the presidential election of 1840 was a highly exciting one, and that during the canvass, the Whigs held many meetings in Illinois and elsewhere, popularly known as log cabin and hard cider demonstrations, in favor of General Harrison for president. About the last of March, one of these meetings, a very large and enthusiastic one, was held at Carthage, the county seat, in which some of the principal Mormons participated. At this meeting, nominations were made for a representative to the state legislature and for various county offices. The ticket was well received by the party and was placed at the head of the editorial columns of the Western World at Warsaw, the Whig organ, where it remained until the 22nd of July, 1840. Now, of course, the Western World, that is what became the Warsaw Signal after Thomas Sharp and his business partner purchased the printing press. In the Western World of that date, it was announced that Mr. Martin Hopkins, the candidate for representative, had withdrawn, and that Dr. John F. Charles had been put up in his place. And what would the reader guess was the reason for this change? The purpose of a party in thus setting aside a good and capable man and substituting another? Simply this. The autocrat of Nauvoo had signified that he would not support Mr. Hopkins. No good ground for such refusal was ever known, but to such extent did party subserviency go in this second year of Mormonism in the state. It is not strange that Smith, ambitious of power and so lately at the bottom round of the ladder, should have been elated at the change and willing to use the power of which he found himself so suddenly in possession. The result was that the whole Whig ticket for the county was elected by an average majority of about 400 votes. A characteristic circumstance in connection with this election deserves to be mentioned. Of the names of Whig electors for president and vice president, that of Abraham Lincoln was scratched by about 200 voters at Nauvoo, and that of his Democratic opponent in the district substituted. Mr. Lincoln had, in some way unknown, rendered himself obnoxious to the prophet. End quote. Put that in context, Lincoln still did win his fourth term in the state legislature, but he wasn't voted in as president of the Whig Party, as Gregg concludes, because he had somehow offended Joseph Smith. So yes, Abraham Lincoln's rise to political power ran into a speed bump because of Joseph Smith. That's the real-world implications of the Mormons' increasing political power in Nauvoo. And they didn't stop there. It wasn't just the Whig convention. To posture themselves and in celebration of the recently returned Brigham and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, we'll talk about that next episode, the Nauvoo Legion came out in full force for another parade, even more grandiose than the Temple Cornerstone laying ceremony back in April. The Times and Seasons had published an article in early June telling the Nauvoo Legion that they were to gather in the town square for a 4th of July celebration on July 3rd, because the 4th was a Sunday in 1841. And attendance was, of course, mandatory. And what a spectacle it was. A number of Illinois government officials attended for a chance to ride around in carriages near the prophet and see the Nauvoo Legion in full battle regalia. Yeah, schmoozing a little bit. Joseph Smith and John C. Reckitt Bennett gave incredibly grand public speeches on the persecution of the saints, declaring how great and powerful the kingdom of God was to become rolling forth over the nation. For Mormons, this was a great moment. For government officials friendly to the Mormons, this was a great moment in realizing how powerful the alliances that they made were. But for everybody else that didn't fall into either of those two camps, what happened here was downright terrifying. In covering the story, Thomas the Sharp Bastard printed this in the following edition of the Warsaw Signal, and he did so in a yes-no question format under the heading of the article, quote, questions for the times and seasons, end quote. And we'll examine the implications of each of these questions and the couched insinuations as we go. From the Warsaw Signal, questions for the times and seasons. Quote, did Joe Smith state at a parade of the Legion, or a part of it, at Nauvoo a few weeks since, that some persons complained because he was a military officer, but that he cared not, for he was general and second in command to the governor, and those who did not like it might go to hell? That's the first question. Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a bit of bias couched into this, but this is tapping into what Joseph Smith talked about during this July 3rd parade. And he was head of the Nauvoo Legion. Joseph Smith standing up there in, full battle uniform with his sword, riding on his white horse. Yeah. Anybody who didn't like him, they can go to hell. Next question. Did he afterwards say that if they did not stop their blab about him, he would be president of the United States? God would give him the office if he wanted it, and then he would show them what a Bonaparte would do? Okay. That is absolutely evil right there. That right there is where that's the first time I have ever seen where Joseph said he will be president of the United States. He possibly might have been muttering it to himself after he met with President Martin Van Buren and was basically laughed out of his office. But here we go. If people don't stop their blab about him, he would be the president of the United States and show them what Napoleon Bonaparte could do. This is not the first time Joseph had ever equated himself to a tyrant, right? He, during the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri, he said that he would become a second Muhammad to this generation. Now he's saying that he would show them what a Bonaparte could do. I mean, imagine this today if, President Nelson, the newest prophet of the church, were to stand up in front of the congregation and televised across the country and say, all of the anti-Mormons out there, we're going to show you what a Hitler would do to slanderous people. I mean, that is absolutely terrifying. The next question. Did he say that the meanest horse thief in his society was better than the editor of the Warsaw Signal or the highest minister of any sectarian church? No, I mean, obviously, that's just Joseph casting shade at the Warsaw Signal and at Thomas Sharp, and I'm sure Thomas Sharp absolutely loved this. Next question. Did Sidney Rigdon afterwards make threats of personal violence on the editor of the Warsaw Signal whenever he should meet him? That's an interesting question, because Sidney Rigdon wasn't out of the picture here. He was still making public orations and, threatening physical violence against Thomas Sharp. Yep, he was a sharp bastard, bringing his justice. Next question. Did General Bennett on Saturday last say that he would call the editor of the Signal a liar whenever he met him for having insinuated that he was not sincere in the faith? We'll let that stand. We merely ask these as questions, having, however, very good authority for saying that they should be answered in the affirmative. End quote. What happened here? Where's the Joseph Smith, looking in his hat and hunting for buried treasure? I mean, where's the Joseph Smith that was, just eating a ton of mushrooms with his friends so that they could see angels floating in the Kirtland Temple? Who is this Joseph Smith standing in front of an army and declaring himself the next POTUS, saying that he'll show the world a real tyrant? You stand this Joseph next to the pious Joseph Smith of Truman Madsen's Prophet series, and they coincide in name alone. This is not the Joseph Smith I knew and loved in the church. This is a powerful demagogue, thirsting for the blood of his enemies. With the help of Natalie on the back end, this little, pulling back the curtain here, I've been doing a few interviews lately, and I'll tell you about these interviews as they released on other podcast feeds. But the number one question that I'm asked when going on another show is also the question I struggle the most to answer. It's usually something along the lines of, what were Joseph Smith's motivations? Why did he do what he did at some arbitrary point in time? And the answer that I can give, and the only answer that is honest here, is truly, I don't know. I may have answered those questions confidently a couple years ago when my deep studies of Mormon history began, but now that I've learned a lot more than a few years back, the answer seems to slip further away with every history book I read about him and Mormonism. Was Joseph in it for the money? Did he just want to sleep with dozens of women and resolved to fabricate a religion to make it happen? Did he sincerely believe his own bullshit? Well, at long last, I may have a simple answer. A simple answer which probably won't surprise any of you, but I've yet to find a single situation where this answer doesn't explain Joseph's motives. So here's my answer for why Joseph Smith did what he did, what his motivations were. Joseph Smith did whatever it was that suited him best at any given moment. Not only that, but he did the utmost version of whatever it was which seemed to be the most beneficial solution for him, but for him alone, which, by extension, means that he did the biggest and baddest version of everything he could when a situation would arise and the solution would benefit him the most. I know, it's disturbingly simple, this answer of he did whatever was best for him. Yet it's equal parts unsurprising and unsatisfactory, isn't it? Philosophers from Aristotle to William of Ockham would be proud with the simplicity and explanatory power of this. From trying to sell the copyright of the Book of Mormon for short-term profit, to starting a religion to take tithing money, to excommunicating all of our cowdry, William Wines Phelps, that's Doubled Up Phelps, and the Whitmers for running their own religion, to the Kirtland Safety Society anti-banking company to solve tens of thousands of dollars in debt, to stealing the property of the Missourians so that the Mormons wouldn't starve, to signing every land contract which landed on his desk regardless of how cancerous the terms may have been, to building a legally sanctioned militia to safeguard against the Illinois militia potentially removing the Mormons as had happened back in Missouri, to producing a divine revelation so that he could sleep with dozens of women, and every little decision in between those major life events during Joe's career, Joseph made the short-sighted decision which seemed to benefit him the most at that very moment. He was an opportunist. He couldn't help but make the best decision at the time, right? And that can't possibly surprise anybody who's listened to the show for longer than a few episodes or who's read a single biography of the man. Nauvoo was a clean tapestry with endless opportunities, and Joe couldn't wait to bust out the paintbrushes. For the first time in Joe's career, the Mormons actually had a significant majority. What incredible tools a majority would afford the saints. And look, the Founding Fathers knew that demagogues like Joseph Smith would eventually arise, so they built into the Constitution various protections for the minority from the majority. It's not exactly unprecedented throughout history where a populace arose behind a thought leader and they used their majority to bully or eradicate a silent minority. The American political system is deliberately slow and calculating to mitigate the damage from people like a Joseph Smith or any other narcissistic tyrant for that matter. Insert whatever name you'd like. But that doesn't mean the government is able to stop these people in their tracks before they cause damage. It can just reduce the impact and slowly correct the damage over time. Joseph Smith was in a wonderful time and place to build his empire. Senators, Governor Carlin, justices, and all manner of politicians were falling over themselves to pander to the growing Mormon voting bloc. And you know that Joe must have loved every minute of it. I mean, just think about this. Joseph was a backwoods country bumpkin 12 years ago. Now he had thousands of followers, his own army, and highly respected public elected officials were asking Joe what they could do to help the Mormons in their plight. How could they solidify their status as a friend of the Mormons? But really, how goddamn American is that? I mean, what an amazing example of rags to riches, right? The American dream isn't a mortgage, a car payment, and a white picket fence in the suburbs and, getting a brew with the boys every Friday night. The American dream operates solely by the central mechanism that Chris iterated so many times to us. The truth simply doesn't matter. The American dream of rags to riches is saying whatever is necessary to serve a person's best interest in that moment with absolute disregard for what truth or reality can tell us of any given moment. Truth and reality didn't matter to Joseph Smith, and he lived a wonderful life punctuated by brief moments of slight discomfort, and he was only able to live that life because he could sell a lie and thousands of people lapped it up like dogs who'd been lost in a spiritual desert for decades before the oasis of Mormonism arose. Joseph Smith is the American dream. His timeline reads like that of a grand villain or a valiant hero, depending on the source. He did things scarcely believable until you dig deep enough, and he built a religion on a reckless string of lies that resulted in one of the most lavish lifestyles in early American history, filled with nice houses, decadent carriages, a harem of concubines, and politicians pandering to his every whim. I don't know about you guys, but when I'm judging something on the America scale, Joe truly ranks among the highest echelons of the most American people in all of American history. Now that the Mormons were finally the majority for the first time since they'd become a religion, Joe and friends could exercise all sorts of privileges they'd never had access to throughout the previous decade of Mormon history. All right, that is going to do it for the main portion of the episode today. Just have a couple of announcements to get everybody up to speed. You can chase the show notes to find a link to the latest Scathing Atheist episode where they did their final wrap-up of the Book of Mormon. You know, kind of like their last final wrap-up was, and the final wrap-up when they finished Moroni. And yeah, whatever. This is like the third final wrap-up. But anyway, we did a Book of Mormon trivia, and it was a really fun episode, so you'll find a link to that in the show notes. Also coming up in, I believe it is 2 days from when this episode is released, I was on the In the Name of God podcast to talk a bit about the growing strife between the FLDS and the LDS church throughout the 1930s, and then how that kind of plays out in today's religious cycle when it comes to Utah. And Matthew the Apostle and I have been good friends since we met back at ReasonCon in 2015, I believe that was. And so he and I have just been in touch, steadily in contact. He's a huge history nerd like myself. He centers around Eastern United States history, particularly out of the 19th century. He's helped me out with the pronunciation on a number of things. So finally, he had me on the podcast, and it was a really good time. You'll find a link to his show in the show notes as well. You can always go to fuckyour.church, and that links right up to his podcast page as well. So with that out of the way, there are 2 more announcements. There is going to be on the Mormon Doctrine subreddit. I announced this last week. I'll be doing this AMA. That's an Ask Me Anything in Reddit speak. So if you'd like to ask any questions or, hear the latest research on the Smith entheogen theory and how the book is coming along, you can just head on over to the Mormon Doctrine subreddit on Saturday. That is Saturday, the 17th of February coming up. I'll be answering questions for most of the day, but particularly in the evening, that's when I'm going to sit down and really hammer some of these out. So be sure to check that, and I'll leave a link to that in the show notes as well. And we are just 3 days away from the presentation that I'm giving at Darwin Day at the Burke Museum on the University of Washington campus. If you're able to make it out and don't have any plans, on Sunday, February 18th, I'd love to see you there. I'm giving a presentation on Darwin versus Joseph Smith, talking about the history of both of these individuals set side by side and kind of championing the life of Charles Darwin. So that should be a really good time. It's a few hours that they're beginning at 11:30 a.m. and I believe it concludes at 2:30 p.m. It's going to be chock full of really great speakers. So if you would like to get there, you'll find links to the show notes for the Seattle Atheist page where they are selling the tickets for that. And I think there are still some free tickets left. So if you have a chance, pick them up. I'd love to see you there. All right, with all that out of the way, we have a couple new patrons to thank. We have from last week, I don't think I got this one. This is Curtis. And then from this week, we have Harvey and Godfried. That is Godfried, who came on the episode last week and talked to us all about the Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. And we also have by Scott. So thank you, all of you, for pledging to support the show over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. And I hope you enjoy the access to all of the extra edition and special edition episodes over there. One quick update on the way that we are formatting the show. As it's been going, I usually put out, 1.5 to 2 episodes in the Patreon feed every week. So there's always the regular episode that's released on the free feed, on the Naked Mormonism feed that you're downloading this from. But there's also over on the Patreon feed a whole bunch of extra content. And I've always just been releasing like 2 episodes on the same day. But I realize that can kind of make a mess of your feed when you're looking through it. It's easy to miss episodes. You can get 2 emails in one day and then you don't hear from me throughout the week. So I'm actually switching those extra Patreon episodes over to Monday nights. We're going to be releasing those Monday nights instead of on Thursday nights. So this upcoming Monday, that's going to be on the 19th of February. You can check your Patreon feed if you're a subscriber over there. We are finally finishing the final chapter of An Address to All Believers in Christ. It's a project that's been inexplicably long in completing, but now we're finally finishing it up. And if you want to listen to all of the Address to All Believers in Christ, that's going to be chapter 10 that's releasing this upcoming Monday. You'll find links to all of the previous episodes that are the rest of the audiobook basically over there. And then at the end, I'm going to ask people what you guys want to hear next. We're going to see what we can dive into next. Maybe it's going to be the manuscript story, Conneaut Creek. Maybe there's another missionary tract that we can pick up on, Remarkable Visions or something out of 1840. There are a lot of fun tracks and smaller books like this to read. Let me know what you guys want to hear, and we'll look forward to corresponding over on the Patreon feed. With all of that said, let's go ahead and shut it down for the evening. I want to start off by thanking Julie for running the Twitter and Facebook pages. Thank you for keeping the conversation going over there and keeping people updated on the guest spots that I've been doing lately. It's been chaos over on this end. Thank you to Natalie for lining up all of those guest spots. She's really making magic work on the back end. Thank you to Jason Camo for providing the music used in the show with his permission. You can go to aloststateofmind.com to hear more of his music there. Thank you to Andrew Torres of the Opening Arguments podcast and the law offices of P. Andrew Torres for providing legal counsel for this show. Thank you once again to all the patrons who support this show and keep the research flowing. And most importantly, thank you to all of the inspiringly admirable listeners out there once again for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. My favorite part about the Warsaw Signal is how it just directly responds to the times and seasons. In announcing the Great Parade at Nauvoo on July 3rd, they talked about how beautiful the women were. This is how the sharp bastard covered it. Great Parade at Nauvoo. We did not attend the Great Mormon Display at Nauvoo on Saturday last, but I have some particulars from a gentleman present. There were in abundance, according to the general opinion, about 3,000 persons, consisting of all sorts and conditions, ages and sexes, women in profusion, some pretty, some ugly, some in the faith, some out of it. Office seekers' friends were there and seemed highly to enjoy the honor of the mighty prophet's companionship. How great would it have been to actually attend that? See Joseph Smith with his sword drawn. We will take Talos and burn this nation. Will be left a smoldering cinder for God to conquer. Yeah, Joseph Smith. Woo! The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.